Well, today it's going to be a brief video. I say that because today, of course, is Easter Day in most of the Christian world. Not, I would stress, the Orthodox world, but in the world of Catholic and Protestant Christianity. And I wish to, first of all, give my Easter greetings to anybody who is celebrating Easter on this particular day. The reason I'm making this video, by the way, despite this day being in most countries, in most Western countries at least, a holiday, is because today we have seen a slight lifting of the fog of war that has generally settled upon the war in Ukraine. And this slight lifting of the fog of war arises from two briefings, one made yesterday, the other made this morning by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, I am not going to provide links to these briefings, to these notes of these briefings. I'm afraid I have made it my policy for the time being, during the course of this war, not to provide links to briefings either by the Russians or by the Ukrainians over the course of this conflict. I do provide links when I quote briefings or articles in some Russian publications like Interfax, which is fully independent of the Russian government. But anyway, what I will do, however, is I will quote the two briefings, and I'm going to read out what the first briefing, the briefing on the 16th of April, what that actually said, and I'm going to focus specifically on what it says about the situation in Mariupol. And it says this: the entire city territory of Mariupol has been completely cleared of militants of the formation Azov, foreign mercenaries and Ukrainian troops. The remnants of the Ukrainian group are currently completely blocked on the territory of the Azovstal metallurgical plant. Their only chance to save their lives is to voluntarily lay down their arms and surrender. Let me remind you that in Mariupol, at the time of the encirclement on March 11th, there were the 36th Separate Marine Brigade, the 109th Territorial Defence Brigade, the 503rd Separate Marine Battalion, a company of the 53rd Separate Mechanised Brigade, units of the 17th Anti-Tank Brigade, formations, right-wing formations. Actually, it uses a different word to right-wing. It refers again to the political movement that existed in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. But anyway, formations Azov, Aidar, Right Sector, police and state border service units, as well as foreign mercenaries. The total number of this group was about 8,100 people. So that is the first official confirmation from the Russians that the entirety of Mariupol is now under their control, except for the Azovstal steelworks. It also lists all the Ukrainian units that were fighting in Mariupol, and it gives a total for the number of Ukrainian personnel who were defending the city. And the number given is 8,100. Now, can I say that is significantly below previous estimates? I've heard reports, in fact, the most common report I've heard is that the total number of Ukrainian troops in Mariupol, blockaded in Mariupol, was 14,500, and that's been the number that I've quoted in most of my programs, though, as I've always said, I was never in any position to corroborate that number. And I'd also seen one claim from a pro-Russian source that put the number at up to 20,000. Well, the Russian Ministry of Defense gives a much lower, significantly lower figure, which is 8,100. That is still, by the way, a significant group of men, as we're going to men and women, by the way, as we're going to discuss shortly. Now, I'm going to say that I had my own doubts. I started to have serious doubts about some of these claims that there were 14,500 or 20,000 Ukrainian troops in Mariupol the day before yesterday, when I researched the sieges in Syria of the Islamic State-controlled city of Raqqa, which is about the same size as Mariupol, and the Islamic State-controlled city in Iraq of Mosul, which has a population of around 3.5 million. And I noticed that both in Raqqa and Mosul, where the sieges went on for much longer than the siege of Mariupol has done, the numbers of fighters of the Islamic State were put at between 5,000 and 10,000 in each case. Now, it didn't seem to me plausible that Ukrainian troops, who are presumably trained to a much higher level than the troops, Islamic State fighters, and who of course possess, I suspect, a much wider range of weapons, would be defeated within weeks, where Islamic State fighters were able to hold out against much heavier odds in both Raqqa and Mosul for months. And I would say that I'm not in any way downplaying the tenacity and fanaticism and courage, if you like, and resilience of Islamic State fighters. And I don't expect Ukrainians to fight with the same sort of fervour, even in defence of one of their own cities. So, I factored that fact in, but it still seemed to me that given the speed, if you like, of this operation, the earlier numbers given of 14,500 and 20,000 simply had to be too high. If it had been 14,500, a figure 40% higher than what looks like the true one, which is 8,100, then I would have expected the fighting in Mariupol to continue for at least a further month over and above what it has up to now. And of course, if it had been 20,000, it would have been much more than that. So 8,100 seems to me about right. I think this is probably a correct figure. And it does, by the way, give us some confidence in light of that in some of the other figures that the Russian Ministry of Defense is now providing. Anyway, to proceed with the words of the briefing, it goes on to say, during the liberation of Mariupol, 1,464 Ukrainian servicemen have already surrendered. The number of surrenders is increasing daily, including those who escaped from the territory of Azovstal. According to their testimonies, the total number of Ukrainian servicemen, again, ultra-right militia, let's call them, and foreign mercenaries who took refuge on Azovstal does not exceed 2,500 people. Thus, on April 16th, in Mariupol alone, the losses of the Ukrainian group amounted to more than 4,000 people. So what the Russians are saying is that there's 2,500 Ukrainian troops made up of assorted units, and some of them as foreign mercenaries, as the Russians call them, that there's 2,500 of these troops now bottled up in the Azovstal steelworks, and 1,464 Ukrainian troops have surrendered, and that must mean that 4,000 Ukrainian troops in Mariupol have died or been very severely wounded over the course of the fighting in Mariupol. And it's difficult to see how that figure can be wrong. Now, the reason the Russians have provided these numbers now is then explained in the next paragraph. Therefore, Ukrainian President Zelensky's recent statements to the Western media that the irreplaceable losses of the Ukrainian military during the operation allegedly amounted to 2,500 to 3,000 are a common lie for him. The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation has reliable data on the true losses of the Ukrainian army, National Guard, and joint foreign mercenaries, which Zelensky is afraid to tell the people of Ukraine. As of today, the irreplaceable losses, now that clearly now means dead and severely wounded, amount to 23,000. Sorry, I'll say that again. As of today, the irreplaceable losses amount to 23,367 people. We will soon publish some data from Ukrainian documents about their losses, revealing the place of death and the burial places of the dead. So, 4,000 Ukrainian troops, either dead or severely wounded, but anyway, irreplaceable in Mariupol. My own sense is that when the Russians say irreplaceable, they essentially mean dead, but I will assume that they also mean severely wounded as well. 4,000 in Mariupol alone, and the Russians then give a precise number for the total that the Ukrainians, total loss rate, death toll, if you like, that the Ukrainians have suffered, which is 23,367. Now, back on the 25th of March, Colonel General Rudskoy of the Russian General Staff said that Ukraine's irreplaceable losses up to that point amounted to 14,000 men. So it looks as if the tempo of operations in Ukraine has intensified since the 25th of March, with another 10,000 or so Ukrainian servicemen or women killed or severely wounded since Colonel General Rudskoy gave that briefing on the 25th of March. So that gives us some sense of what the Russians claim are total Ukrainian losses. Now, I want to say again that these are Russian claims. I can't independently corroborate them. The Russians have clearly been goaded into making that statement by Zelensky's claim that Ukraine has lost only 2,500 to 3,000 troops. I was skeptical about that figure yesterday. I inclined to believe these Russian numbers. They seem consistent with what we have seen, and of course the total losses in Mariupol seem to be correct if we assume that there were indeed 8,100 Ukrainian troops trapped in Mariupol on the 11th of March, which does seem to be the correct number for the reasons I've discussed previously. Well, the Russians then followed up with a further briefing today, which gives a further information about the state of the fighting in Mariupol, and I'm going to read it out again briefly. During the offensive to liberate Mariupol city, a special operation to free hostages held by Ukrainian ultra-right militias in the Turkish mosque was carried out in Primorsky district on April 16th at the request of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. As a result of the courageous actions of the Russian Special Operations Group, presumably means Russian Special Forces, the Ukrainian defenders of the mosque were defeated, 29 militants, including foreign mercenaries, were killed. Hostages, citizens of a CIS country, that's the Commonwealth of Independent States country, were released and taken to a safe location. It's an interesting observation. One wonders which country. I'm going to guess that it's Azerbaijan, and I say that because Azerbaijan is a close ally of Turkey, and that would presumably explain why Erdogan was lobbying the Russians for action to liberate these people that were being held in the mosque. Anyway, the briefing then goes on to say the following. A Ukrainian group encircled and completely blockaded in Mariupol on the territory of the Azovstal plant has been asked to voluntarily lay down arms and surrender in order to save their lives. Now, this relates to something that happened on the afternoon of the 16th of April, and it was very widely reported in the Russian media. And briefly, the Russian military gave the forces in Azovstal a time window this morning in which to surrender en masse to the Russians or to face destruction. And they said, the Russian Ministry of Defense said, that they'd intercepted a vast amount of radio traffic from the Ukrainian grouping in the Azovstal steelworks, telling the Ukrainian High Command in Kiev that they had almost entirely run out of food and water, and repeatedly begging for permission to surrender. And the Russian Ministry of Defense went on to say that the authorities in Kiev rejected the proposal to surrender, told the forces in the Azovstal steelworks to keep fighting, and apparently, and this is again, I stress, all from the Russians, threatened the troops in the Azovstal steelworks with retaliatory action if they did indeed surrender. Now, I want to stress all this is from the Russians. I cannot independently corroborate this. It seems highly plausible to me, but of course it's only the Russians who are telling us that they've intercepted these communications, and it's only the Russians who are telling us what was in those communications, and the fact that it was that the troops in the Azovstal works factory were asking permission from the authorities in Kiev to surrender. So, as I said, it's the Russians who are telling us this. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it seems plausible. Anyway, it was undoubtedly the case that there was a brief ceasefire this morning, which is to say the morning of the 17th of April. And then we got the next part of the Russian briefing. However, the Kiev nationalist regime, according to radio intercepts, forbade negotiations on surrender, ordering members of the ultra-right militias to shoot on sight anyone willing to lay down their arms amongst the Ukrainian soldiers and foreign mercenaries at the plant. In total, according to Ukrainian servicemen who have surrendered, up to 400 foreign mercenaries are now encircled on the territory of the Azovstal plant as part of the Ukrainian grouping. Most of them are citizens of European countries, as well as Canada. We previously reported that radio conversations between militants in Mariupol were conducted in 6 foreign languages. In the case of further resistance, they will all be eliminated. So, the Russians say that there are 400 foreigners, 400 Westerners in the Azovstal steelworks, trapped in the Azovstal steelworks, being prevented from surrendering by Ukrainian right-wing militia who are also in the plant and there with other Ukrainian troops, and who are both refusing to surrender themselves and, in accordance with orders being sent from Kiev, are preventing or threatening others, be these Western volunteers, let's call them volunteers rather than mercenaries, and Ukrainian soldiers, threatening these Westerners and the Ukrainian soldiers if they do try to surrender themselves. Now, again, I can't corroborate that. I don't think anybody can. I would say that one does wonder how ultra-right militia would be in a position to prevent armed men laying down, with moving or retreating from the plant and handing themselves into the Russians if they wanted to. I mean, this looks like something of a recipe, if it were true, for some kind of infighting amongst the Ukrainian grouping in Azovstal. But, I'm not saying that this isn't true. And of course, one mustn't ever underestimate the sense of pressure that military discipline places upon soldiers. They may be most unwilling to go on fighting. They may be willing to surrender, but against that, they're bound by their oath and by military discipline, and it's entirely plausible that some of them have decided that the only way that they can execute that oath is by fighting to the end. A grisly fate, though that seems to me to be. Anyway, the Russians then go on to describe the number of people that they call foreign mercenaries who are in Ukraine, and they provide some extremely precise numbers. Since the start of the special military operation, the Kiev regime has brought 6,824 foreign mercenaries from 63 countries to Ukraine. The largest group came from Poland, 1,717 people. About 1,500 mercenaries came from the US, Canada, and also Romania. From Britain and Georgia, that is, of course, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, each up to 300 men. 193 arrived from Turkish-controlled areas of the Syrian Arab Republic. The majority of these volunteers, the Russians say mercenaries, are now deployed in Ukrainian groups in Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, Nikolaev, and Mariupol. Their deployment in the groups is handled by the regional coordination headquarters of the so-called International Legion of Defense of Ukraine in Belaya Tserkov city. As a result of the hostilities, the number of volunteers has steadily declined and currently stands at 4,877. Russian armed forces have eliminated 1,035 foreign fighters in combat operations. Another 912 refused to take part in hostilities and escaped from the country. Let me remind you that foreign mercenaries do not have the status of combatants under international humanitarian law. They came to Ukraine to make money by killing Slavs. So the best that can happen to them is criminal liability and long terms of imprisonment. By the way, on the last point, that these combatants are not really combatants and are not covered by international humanitarian law or war crimes law, I personally disagree. That's a topic for a completely different discussion. My own view is that these people are covered by international humanitarian law and war crimes law, even if they have not come to this battle with particularly pure motives. But that is a big subject which I'm going to discuss in a completely different program. Anyway, that's a fairly interesting breakdown of the number of foreign fighters in Ukraine. It suggests that their numbers are falling. it suggests again that the Russians have an extraordinary accurate picture of their number and of where they are. And of course, it seems that a significant grouping of them, 400, is trapped in the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. So, do we believe any of this? As I said, I think I generally do. I think that these figures look plausible to me. It's interesting that the Russians have now confirmed that the number of Ukrainian troops encircled in Mariupol, 8,100, was significantly less than some of the estimates that we've been seeing flying around. And all of these figures feel right to me. Now, I say feel because I can't corroborate them, as I once again reiterate, I can't give precise numbers on Ukrainian troops or indeed Russian troops. I can't give precise numbers on casualties of any side. But these figures, judging from what I've been following about the course of the war, look to me to be credible and probably correct. If they are correct, then they do reinforce a view which I have long had, which is that the Russians have an exceptionally advanced and effective intelligence operation in Ukraine. They seem to know where everybody is. They seem to know the precise number of those people wherever they are. They have extraordinarily accurate targeting data. And one wonders how they're obtaining this information. I am not going to try to speculate about that, by the way. But anyway, that's what I would say about this general picture. Now, what's going to happen next? Well, it does look increasingly as if, with the deadline given to the Ukrainian soldiers to surrender in Mariupol, we're now coming up to the final stage of the battle for Mariupol. The destruction, I think it's more plausibly going to be a destruction, and then presumably the storming of whatever is left of the Azovstal steelworks. Now, I say that because the latest reports from Russia is that the Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal steelworks, as was predicted by Denis Bushilin, the Prime Minister of the Donetsk People's Republic, those troops are refusing to surrender or have not surrendered, and there's not been a mass surrender of these troops in the Azovstal steelworks. So the Russians are now saying that the time period has expired and they are preparing for their military strikes on the Azovstal steelworks. And I've heard more reports that Tupolev 22M3 bombers, as I said, I'm assuming that they're operating with bunker-busting bombs, that, again, I can't confirm that, are now once again in operation. And we will no doubt see a major intensification of the bombing and shelling of the Azovstal steelworks until it is finally stormed, which will take, well, I'm not going to even try and guess, days, I suppose. But as I'm not a military person, I'm not in a position to say. Well, we're also getting other reports from other places in Ukraine, and all of them talk about a steady intensification of the battle. We've seen a major escalation of missile strikes across Ukraine, including missile strikes on KIEV. The Russian Air Force is apparently now heavily bombing Ukrainian formations in Donbass. I think quite absurdly, people are linking this with the loss of the Moskva cruiser. It doesn't make any kind of sense to me. On the contrary, all of this looks to me to be obviously preparatory for the major offensive that the Russians are working towards launching in Donbass, which we've been talking about for several days now. And all of this looks to me completely consistent with that prearranged plan. So massive shelling, massive bombing of the troops, the Ukrainian troops in the Donbass, heavy interdiction of supplies and troops elsewhere in Ukraine, that sort of thing. And there have been two, or rather I should say three, rather interesting pieces of information. There was apparently a tank battle somewhere south of Izium. The Ukrainians have been trying to launch various counterattacks against this large Russian grouping, which is apparently growing in size south of Izium. There was a tank battle. Apparently the Ukrainians were defeated. There's been more attempts apparently to launch missile strikes, these anti-tank missile strikes, presumably using either Javelin missiles or these new Switchblade drones on Russian tanks, but so far without apparently much success, and the Russians are crediting this to the effectiveness of the reactive armor systems that their tanks are protected by. Well, again, that's what the Russians say. I can't confirm that one way or the other. And there's also been a report from the Russians that they shot down a Ukrainian transport aircraft carrying Western weapons to Odessa. Now that's an interesting development because the Russians, as we've heard, apparently gave some kind of a warning to the Americans about unpredictable consequences if the United States continued to supply weapons to Ukraine. And the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said a few days ago that if Western personnel and vehicles entered Ukraine to try to deliver weapons, they would immediately become a target. Well, it could be. It does seem as if the Western powers are heeding that warning. And so these weapon systems, which have been delivered to Poland, then have to be collected by the Ukrainians, who then have to try and find some way of bringing these weapon systems into Ukraine. But they're becoming obviously targeted by the Russian Air Force and missile forces. And we've now heard about this particular aircraft being shot down. But perhaps there is one other development which ought to ring particular alarm bells in Kiev, which is that we've been hearing more reports that more and more towns across Kherson and Zaporozhye regions, which are either entirely or largely occupied by the Russians, are now replacing Ukrainian flags with Russian flags, with new pro-Russian administrations being created, and that in Kherson there are now the first moves towards staging a referendum on Kherson's secession from Ukraine. And one does wonder whether this is supported by the authorities in Moscow, and whether, if such a referendum is indeed held, whether there's ever going to be any prospect of Ukraine regaining control of Kherson and possibly of Zaporozhye too. Now, I should say that the Russians apparently control most of Zaporozhye region. They have not attempted to capture the city of Zaporozhye itself, even though that is largely Russian-speaking, and there's supposedly quite widespread pro-Russian sentiment there. I'm going to make a guess that the primary reason for that is because Zaporozhye is the location of the giant Mercouris factory, a factory and combine created by the Soviet Union, which makes gas turbines, including gas turbines used for aircraft engines and helicopter engines, and also for ships, for turbines that propel ships, ship engines. And Mercouris was a major supplier of this sort of equipment to the Soviets when, of course, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Now, that all ceased in 2014 But Motosic, unlike other factories in Ukraine, did find alternative buyers in China, and the Chinese are major investors in Motosic. And I would have thought that would make the Russians extremely wary of attacking the city in a way which might damage that particular factory. But elsewhere, they're showing no such inhibitions. We're getting reports every day now of the Russians attacking factories and industrial facilities across Ukraine, which they claim are linked with the Ukrainian war effort. So that's where we are with the military situation, or so it seems to me. Now, I'm going to return one last time to the topic of the Moskva, the cruiser that sank in the Black Sea. Now, in the hours and days after the sinking, all kinds of claims were circulated that the entire crew, or most of the crew, had been lost, and a senior Ukrainian official, Anton Gerashchenko, who is a special advisor at Ukraine's Interior Ministry, a position, by the way, which in no way reflects his enormous influence and importance in Ukraine. Anyway, Gerashchenko claimed that the Moskva's captain was amongst those who had died. Well, yesterday there was a ceremony in Sevastopol where the crew of the Moskva was gathered and addressed by the commander-in-chief of Russia's Navy. And this commander-in-chief promised the crew that those of them who were professional seamen would re-enlist, would remain, would have jobs in the Russian Navy, though the conscripts who were also serving in the Moskva crew would be allowed to return to their homes within a few months when their periods of service ends. Now, one person who was indisputably there was Moskva's captain, which shows firstly that he is not dead, and secondly that whatever it was that happened to Moskva, he is not being blamed, or presumably is not being blamed, for the ship's loss. That's one thing. The second is that it is impossible to give, from the pictures that I have seen, a complete sense of how many of these sailors were there, but it did look to me as if there were several hundred. I mean, that's my best guess, and that rather reinforces my view, or rather not my view, but what the Russians have said, which is that the crew was almost entirely rescued. If there were any casualties, they're probably certainly far fewer than the Ukrainians and Western governments have been claiming. Now, I would have thought that was good news, by the way. I can't understand why people would want to see hundreds of people die, but I'm afraid some people in the Western media have leapt onto this war in ways that I find disturbing and seem to want as many people to die as possible. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. I don't think we have any more clarity, by the way, on what exactly happened to the Moskva. Photographs of the ship must exist. There were Western drones apparently flying around, so they would have presumably been able to take pictures. And of course, the US surely possesses data on exactly what happened to the ship, which it's not releasing. And of course, the Russians haven't provided any pictures either. Each side, for the moment, is sticking to their story. Now, I don't know what the truth is here. I discussed it yesterday in my previous program, and I'm not going to repeat myself. All I will say is that after I made that program, I had a discussion with Tom Longo, and he suggested that Moskva probably had been struck by two anti-ship missiles, and that the Ukrainians were only able to do this with the assistance of, with the active assistance of a NATO state, and that the reason that the Pentagon is being so reticent about what actually happened, it's only providing qualified confirmation via anonymous officials who are giving their views as something that they believe as opposed to what they know, is that the Pentagon doesn't want to confirm that one particular NATO country, the one that was involved in this particular incident, acted in the way that it did, because that would make it a co-belligerent. Well, I can't confirm that, obviously, that's just a theory, but it's certainly a plausible and an interesting one. It would also, if it were true, by the way, suggest that whichever NATO country that was, and Britain is an obvious possibility, whichever country that was, acted contrary to the Pentagon's wishes, and that the Pentagon is very unhappy about what happened, and that the Pentagon is working with the Russians to try to, shall we say, limit the damage from this affair, and that's why it's saying as little about it as possible, and it could be that the Russians are responding by doing the same. Well, it all seems to me very plausible, and it would suggest some extremely strong words being exchanged in private. But I want to make it clear that this is a theory, an interesting one, a plausible one, but at the moment only a theory, and obviously, as I so often say, I cannot confirm it. Anyway, the overall take is that we do seem to be now seeing phase 2, this big Russian offensive in Donbass, gradually, steadily cranking up momentum. And by the way, I would say that I've also received reports of Russian the Donbass militia advances in all sorts of places. But if I spend all my time going through all of those reports, none of which can be independently corroborated, by the way, well, this program would go on for, well, considerably more than an hour. So I'm skipping all of that. But clearly there's a lot of intense fighting going on in Donbass now. It does seem as if the situation in Mariupol is now reaching its eventual conclusion. Perhaps the most important thing for me is these revelations about these claims by the Russians of Ukrainian casualties. If Ukraine is losing, has indeed lost, as the Russians say, 23, almost 24,000 men, if the number of people who are dying in this war is escalating at that level, so that from 14,000 on the 25th of March to, well, the precise number is 23,367 as of yesterday, with probably several hundred more about to die in the Azovstal steelworks. Well, this would show what a tremendous war this is and how devastating it is turning out to be for Ukraine. One of the points that Zelensky made over that really ill-judged set of comments which he made about Ukrainian losses was that the biggest defeat that the Ukrainians have suffered up to now was in the Battle of Ilovaisk, which took place in 2014, in the summer of 2014, when around 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. Well, as has been pointed out by any number of Russian commentators, the reality is that Ukraine has suffered a far bigger defeat, or is in the process of suffering a far bigger defeat, and is experiencing far heavier losses in Mariupol alone. And already we can see the total Ukrainian losses in this war up to now, and it's only been ongoing for several weeks, that already these losses are, according to the Russians at least, in the order of 20 to 25,000, with the numbers growing and likely to grow much further and increasing exponentially. Well, I've repeatedly said that the correct thing for Ukraine to do at this point is to negotiate and achieve peace, not to let itself be talked into continuing fighting by the siren voices of its so-called friends in the West, people like Boris Johnson, for example. I really do hope that the Ukrainians finally come to that realization. There is now a real risk that they're going to lose Kherson as well if these rumors about a referendum being prepared there are true, and I think that's highly likely, by the way. And of course, over and above that, there is the fact of all of these young men dying. I would have thought this situation imperatively calls for negotiations and for peace. Yesterday, Zelensky seemed to say something in a very muddled way about the need for some kind of agreement with the Russians. He was talking about 2 draft treaties in place of 1. Well, these are technical issues which should not get in the way of a final resolution of this conflict. I hope, though I'm far from convinced, that Zelensky, or rather the people around him, are finally once again realizing that this situation is a calamitous one for Ukraine, and that they will now negotiate in earnest a way out of this crisis. If they don't, well, more men will die, more women will die, more people will die, more of Ukraine will be destroyed, more territory will be lost. I would have thought that the obvious and correct thing to do to negotiate is obvious, but we will see whether Zelensky and his officials do that. Well, that's enough from me today. More from me soon. I look forward to you joining me again on this channel and on our other channels.